Now we're going to look at finding the trig values of reciprocal functions. We've done these problems with sine, cosine, and tangent. Now we're going to do them with cosecant, secant, and cotangent. And there's just one additional step to what we've done before. It's just remembering which reciprocal function goes with which one. So when we see this cosecant of 120, the first thing we're going to do is draw the angle 120 and find a reference angle and make a triangle and label it like we've done before. So here's my angle, 120 degrees. It has a reference angle of 60. One of its sides of the reference angle is on the x-axis, so that's where I'll draw my triangle with one side on the x-axis. This is a 30, 60, 90. I'm going to label it in its traditional way. Opposite 30 is 1, but it's negative since it's going in the negative x direction. Opposite 60 is square root of 3, and the hypotenuse is 2. So I know the three sides, adjacent, opposite, and hypotenuse. Now I just have to remember that cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. And I know that sine is opposite over hypotenuse, so this has to be hypotenuse over opposite. So hypotenuse is 2, and the opposite side is the square root of 3, and so that's my answer. Secant of 225. Let's draw a 225 degree angle. This is going to have a 45 degree reference angle in quadrant 3. So when we label the sides of the triangle, it's going to be -1, -1, positive square root of 2 for the hypotenuse. Secant is the reciprocal of cosine. We know that cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, so this has to be hypotenuse over adjacent. So the hypotenuse is the square root of 2, the adjacent side is -1, so this is negative, or square root of 2 over -1, or negative square root of 2. Cotangent of 330. So I'm going to draw my 330 degree angle, which is in quadrant 4. It has a 30 degree reference angle. So I have a 30, 60, 90 triangle. Opposite 30 is -1, opposite 60 is positive square root of 3, and the hypotenuse is 2. Tangent is opposite over adjacent, so this is going to be adjacent over opposite. So the adjacent side is the square root of 3, the opposite is -1, so square root of 3 over -1, or negative square root of 3. So far so good, not too bad. Just taking the triangle and just reversing the ratio. Now the next three, however, are ones where you can't draw the triangle, so those are always a little more problematic. And I just want to talk to you about different ways we can think of these, because we've learned several. We know several different ways now. So one thing you can think of when you're dealing with an angle called a quadrantal angle that lands on 0, 90, 180, 270. One thing you can do is thinking about for 0 or 180. Okay, so if we're here or here, and we try to draw like a little skinny triangle, remember the opposite equals 0 and the adjacent equals the hypotenuse. Or we have here the opposite, the negative adjacent equals the hypotenuse. So that'd be negative. That's to help you remember little triangles. And then for 90 and 270, we have a situation where we'd have our little skinny triangle this way, or our little skinny triangle this way, and we'd have basically the adjacent side equals 0. Wow, that's sloppy. Sorry, my adjacent really looks sloppy. The adjacent side equals 0, and the opposite side equals the hypotenuse. Or in this case, the opposite equals the hypotenuse, but the opposite is negative. Okay, so that's one way to think about it. Another way to remember it is to think of the unit circle. The unit circle, remember, has a radius of 1, so this would be the point 1, 0, 0, 1, -1, 0, and 0, -1. So we can think cosine of theta equals x, sine, remember we have this This is 1, this is x, and this is y. So cosine of theta equals x, sine of theta equals y, and tangent of theta is equal to opposite over adjacent, which would be y over x. So if I wanted to find cosine of 90, for example, cosine of 90 is 0, sine of 90 is 1, tangent of 90 is y over x, 1 over 0, which is undefined. So that's another way to find, and that's one popular way to find it. If I want to know what's cosine of 180, it would be -1, because cosine goes with x. A third way then would be to think of the graphs. Okay, so here I have 90, 180, 270, 360. And I want to find, and this is sine. Okay, so sine of theta, y equals sine of theta. I have my graph important points like this. Here's my important points. Actually, I'll put them in red to just emphasize important points. This is my sine graph. High is at 1, low is at -1. So sine of 0 is 0, sine of 90 is 1, sine of 180 is 0, sine of 270 is -1, sine of 0 is 360. So then if I look at y equals cosine of theta, and I know you're thinking, we haven't even gotten to these problems yet, you're just showing me all this junk. Well, this is hopefully helpful junk. 90, 180, 270, 360. Now I'm looking at cosine. Starts at 1, ends at -1. I'm going to go key points. Cosine is a cup that starts up. So here's what the cosine graph looks like. So if I want to know cosine of 0 is 1, cosine of 90 is 0, cosine of 180 is -1, cosine of 270 is 0, cosine of 360 is 1. And then I can think of tangent as slope. Tangent equals slope. So 0 or 180, slope equals 0, so tangent equals 0. 90, 270, slope is undefined, so tangent is undefined. So these are ways that you can help figure out sine, cosine, and tangent for angles that you can't draw a triangle for. And if you can find sine, cosine, and tangent, then you can find secant, cosecant, and cotangent. So let's think about secant. Secant of 270. So using one of the methods below, we need to figure out, first of all, what is cosine of 270? Cosine of 270, well, we could think of, if I drew a little triangle at 270 degrees, the opposite side equals the hypotenuse, but the adjacent side equals 0, so cosine would have to be 0, because adjacent side is 0. If we look at the unit circle, we could say x is cosine, and at 270 degrees, the unit circle has an x value of 0, so cosine is 0. Or we could look at the cosine graph and say cosine of 270 is 0. So all of those things tell us that cosine of 270 is 0. Since secant is the reciprocal of cosine, then secant would be 1 over 0, which is undefined. So secant is undefined. Cotangent of 270, going straight down. This is vertical. So this has a slope equals 0. Or sorry, slope is undefined. Slope is undefined. That means tangent of 270 is undefined. Or we can think of it, it's y over x. Y over x is -1 over 0. So the reciprocal of that undefined is going to be 0. Reciprocal of undefined is 0. Okay, cosecant of -180. -180 goes around this way, but it's still the same as +180. Okay, so this is -180, same as +180. So if we look at sine of 180, or sine of -180, same thing. So since we have a graph that's just from 0 to 180, let me just say it's the same as 180, so let's just look at sine of 180. So if we look at 180, we can say, oh, at 180, the opposite side equals 0. So sine is 0. Or we could look at the graph and say sine is 0 at 180 degrees. Or we could look at the y-coordinate on the unit circle and say sine is 0 at 180 degrees. So sine of 180 equals 0, which means its reciprocal cosecant is undefined. So hopefully that'll help you out with finding not only trig values of reciprocal functions, but also when we're dealing with quadrantal angles, angles that fall in between the quadrants.